The first thing Rose Callahan heard when she stepped onto Whitaker Ranch was not welcome, not instruction, not even her own name, but laughter loud enough to make every horse in the yard lift its head. She stood beside the freight wagon with one gloved hand on a flour sack and the other around the handle of a battered brown valise, her boots sinking half an inch into the dry Montana dirt. The wind caught the loose edge of her bonnet and snapped it against her cheek. Someone near the corral whistled low. Someone else muttered, not nearly quiet enough, "That's the new cook?" Then Harlan Briggs, the ranch foreman, leaned on the fence rail with a grin sharp as a bent nail and said, "Looks like the flour found its barrel." The men around him broke open laughing. Rose felt the sound hit her the way cold rain hits a window, hard but outside. She did not look down at herself. She knew what they saw. A full-figured woman in a plain travel dress, sleeves worn shiny at the elbows, apron folded over one arm like the only flag she had left. She had heard worse in cleaner places. She had survived worse from people who smiled while saying it. So she bent, took hold of the flour sack, and lifted it against her hip. The old stitching gave way. White flour burst out in a soft cloud and spilled down the front of her dark skirt, across her gloves, over the toes of her boots. The laughter doubled. Rose closed her eyes once, only once. When she opened them, she brushed flour from her sleeve, picked up what remained of the sack, and started toward the house. That was when she saw the little girl on the porch. The child could not have been more than 7, thin as a reed, with pale hair hanging loose around a face too still for childhood. She stood on the top step holding a rag doll by one arm, watching Rose as if the whole ranch yard had disappeared. No one else saw the loose board beneath her shoe. No one saw the doll slip from her hand and tumble into the mud below. The girl reached for it. Her boot slid. Rose moved before thinking. The flour sack dropped. Her valise hit the dirt. She crossed the yard with a speed no laughing man expected from her, caught the child around the waist, and steadied her before she could fall from the porch. The ranch went quiet so suddenly the wind seemed rude for continuing. The girl's small fingers curled into Rose's apron, not frightened, not crying, just holding on. Rose loosened her hands at once and whispered, "Easy now, sweetheart. You're all right." The front door opened behind them. A tall man stepped out, hat low, jaw shadowed, blue eyes cold enough to belong to winter. Caleb Whitaker did not look at the laughing men. He looked at Rose's hands near his daughter, then at Rose's flour-covered dress, then at the child gripping her apron, as if she had found something worth keeping. His right hand rested near the holster at his belt, though he did not draw. "Take your hands off my daughter," he said. Rose lifted both hands slowly and stepped back. "Yes, sir." The little girl's fingers tightened in the apron for half a breath before they slipped away. Caleb noticed. Rose noticed that he noticed. The foreman cleared his throat, trying to find his laughter again, but it would not come. Caleb came down one step. He was lean from work, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that made other men careful. "You Rose Callahan?" "I am." "You came for the cook position?" She looked at the flour in the dirt, the men by the corral, the child staring at her with wide, solemn eyes. Then she straightened her back. "If the position's still open." Harlan snorted. "Boss, she already wasted half the flour getting out of the wagon." Rose did not turn. Caleb's gaze shifted to Harlan, and the yard cooled another degree. "Did I ask you?" Harlan's mouth shut. Caleb looked back at Rose. For the first time since she had arrived, his eyes did not move over her like a judgment. They stopped on her face, as if he were trying to decide whether the woman covered in flour had just saved his daughter by accident or by instinct. "Kitchen's this way," he said. "You can cook one meal. If it's decent, we'll talk about morning." Rose picked up her valise. The little girl bent, rescued the rag doll from the mud, and held it against her chest. As Rose passed, the child reached out and touched the cleanest corner of her apron, just once, like a secret. Caleb saw that too. He opened the door and stood aside, but his voice remained hard. "One meal, Mrs. Callahan. That's all I'm promising." Rose stepped into the dim house, where the air smelled of cold ashes, old grief, and a kitchen that had forgotten fire. Behind her, the men no longer laughed. In front of her, Caleb Whitaker watched as though he had meant to send her away before supper, and had just discovered he could not look away. The inside of the Whitaker house felt colder than the yard. Rose noticed it before the door had even closed behind her, that strange cabin cold that did not come from weather alone. The hearth held ashes, but no flame. The parlors smelled faintly of dust, boot leather, and rooms that had learned to be quiet. A woman's shawl still hung on a peg by the stairs, pale blue and untouched, as though the owner had only stepped out for a moment and everyone had been afraid to move it since. Rose saw it, then looked away. Some grief did not invite questions. Caleb carried his silence like a loaded thing. He crossed the hall without asking if she needed help with her valise, and Rose followed with flowers still clinging to her skirt. Behind them, the little girl came in softly, her muddy doll tucked against her chest. Caleb turned at the sound of her steps. His face changed for one breath, not softer exactly, but less guarded, as if all the hard lines in him knew her name. "Lily," he said. The child stopped. He held out his hand. She did not take it. Instead, her eyes moved past him to Rose. Caleb saw that, and the hardness returned. "Go wash up." Lily looked down at the doll, then at the kitchen doorway. "Lily," he repeated, quieter this time. The girl obeyed, slipping down the hall without a word. Rose kept her gaze on the floorboards until Caleb spoke again. "Kitchen is through there." The room he showed her had once been the heart of the house. Rose could tell by the size of the stove, the long work table, the hooks over the wall, and the row of jars lined above the pantry door. But now the stove was black. And cold. A skillet sat unwashed near the basin. 2 cracked plates rested on the table beside a heel of bread so hard it looked more like kindling than food. The curtains had gone gray at the edges. The only warm thing in the room was the late sun lying thin across the floor. Caleb stopped beside the table. "You will cook supper tonight. Beans are in the pantry. Salt pork is in the barrel. There may be potatoes left if they have not gone soft." "How many mouths?" Rose asked. 9 men in the bunkhouse tonight. Myself. My daughter. 11 plates, then. 10, he said. Rose looked at him. Caleb's jaw tightened. Lily does not eat with the men. Rose did not ask why. She set her valise beside the pantry wall and placed the torn flour sack on the table. 10 plates and 1 small one kept warm. Caleb stared at her. "I said 10. Rose brushed flour from her gloves. "I heard you." Something passed across his face, quick and unreadable. He turned toward the door, then stopped. "There are rules in this house, Mrs. Callahan. I expected there would be. You are here to cook. Nothing more." "Yes, sir." "You sleep on the cot by the pantry. It is narrow, but it is clean enough." "Clean enough will do. You do not go upstairs." "No, sir." "You do not open closed doors." "No, sir." His eyes moved toward the hall where Lily had gone. "You do not speak to my daughter unless she speaks to you first." Rose folded her hands in front of her apron. "I understand. And when I find another cook, you leave." The words were plain, almost businesslike, but Rose heard the warning beneath them. "Do not settle in. Do not matter. Do not make this house need you." She had heard different versions of that warning in boarding houses, church kitchens, and back rooms where women smiled while measuring her worth by the width of her hips and the emptiness of her purse. She nodded once. "Then I will make sure you eat well until that day." Caleb looked at her as if he had expected pleading and found a closed door instead. "You have 2 hours. Then I had better start now." He left her there with the cold stove and the hard bread. Rose waited until his footsteps faded before she let out the breath she had been holding. Her hands shook only a little as she removed her gloves. She was checking the pantry shelves when a small sound touched the doorway. Lily stood there, clean-faced now, still holding the rag doll. Rose remembered the rule and said nothing. The child stepped into the kitchen, crossed to the work table, and placed the muddy doll on the chair nearest Rose's valise. Then she looked up, solemn and silent, as if she had given an answer no one had asked for. Rose did not smile too wide. She only touched 2 fingers to her apron and gave the smallest nod. Lily turned and vanished down the hall. Rose looked at the doll, then at the cold stove, and for the first time since arriving, she reached for the kindling like a woman who intended to stay warm. Rose found the kindling damp, the salt jar nearly empty, and the flour bin smelling faintly sour beneath the good layer someone had scattered on top. She stood in the pantry doorway for a moment, one hand on her hip, the other holding a tin scoop, and listened to the house breathe around her. It was not a peaceful sound. It was the creak of boards that had gone too long without footsteps, the tick of a cold stove, the distant murmur of men outside waiting for her to fail. She took off her bonnet, pinned back the loose pieces of hair at her temples, and began. The first fire smoked more than it burned. Rose opened the stove door, crouched low, and fed in slivers of crate which she shaved with the kitchen knife. Smoke stung her eyes. Flour streaked one cheek. She did not wipe it away. By the time the first flame caught, Harlan Briggs filled the back doorway with his broad shoulders and his satisfied grin. "Having trouble already?" he asked. Rose set the coffee pot on the stove. "Only with wet wood." "Wood is wood. A cook ought to know what to do with it. A foreman ought to know how to keep it dry." The grin slipped for half a second. Behind him, two ranch hands made low sounds into their sleeves. Harlan stepped inside and dropped a burlap sack onto the table. "Boss said you needed potatoes." Rose opened the sack. Half were soft. Two had sprouted. Eyes long as sewing needles. She looked up. "These are what you feed the hogs?" "They are what we have." "Then the hogs have been patient." This time no one laughed loudly, but she heard one man cough into his palm. Harlan leaned close enough that his shadow fell across the table. Big words for a woman on one meal's mercy. Rose picked up a potato, cut away the bad portion, and dropped the good into a bowl. "Mercy is free, Mr. Briggs. Supper takes work." He left with his boots striking the floor harder than needed. Rose waited until the door swung shut, then moved faster. She trimmed the salt pork, rinsed the beans, cut the salvageable potatoes small enough to soften, and set onions to brown in a skillet she had scrubbed until her wrists ached. The kitchen began to change by inches. First came the smell of coffee, dark and honest. Then onion, then pepper, then pork, then stew thickening slow in the pot. She found a heel of hard bread, soaked it, worked it with the last of the clean flour, and coaxed biscuits from dough that had no right becoming tender. Once, she turned and saw Caleb standing in the hall. He did not enter. He only watched the smoke lift, watched her hands move, watched the table clear itself beneath her work. "Need something, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked without stopping. His eyes went to the stove, then to the row of plates she had set out. "No, supper will be ready in 20 minutes. Men are used to eating rough. Then tonight will surprise them." He looked as though he might answer, but the small sound of feet came from behind him. Lily stood partly hidden by the wall, her rag doll clutched tight against her chest. Rose remembered the rule and lowered her eyes back to the biscuit pan. Caleb turned to his daughter. "Go on, Lily." The child did not move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the stove, on the steam rising from the stew, on the chair where her doll had been placed earlier and now sat watching the kitchen like a guest. Caleb followed her eyes. Something in his face tightened, not anger, not quite pain, but something that had lived too long without being touched. "She does not sit in here," he said quietly. Rose slid the biscuit pan into the oven. "I did not ask her to." Lily took one step into the kitchen. Caleb went still. Rose kept her hands busy, poured coffee into tin cups, set spoons beside bowls, lifted the stew from the heat. When the ranch hands came in, they came ready to smirk. The smell stopped them just past the threshold. One man removed his hat without seeming to know he had done it. Harlan sat hard at the end of the table, face closed. Rose served him first. He took a bite as if doing her a favor, then chewed twice and said nothing. The silence spread. Caleb remained standing until every man had a bowl. Only then did Rose set a plate at the small side table, where the food would stay warm. Caleb saw it. His eyes met hers. She did not explain. At last he took his own spoonful. For a moment, he forgot to swallow. The room seemed to notice before he did. His hand lowered slowly to the table. Outside, the evening wind moved across the porch boards. Inside, for the first time in longer than anyone wanted to say, Whitaker Ranch smelled like supper. Then Lily crossed the room, pulled the small chair closer to Rose, climbed onto it with her doll in her lap, and waited for the plate that had been kept warm for her. For a moment, no one moved. The men sat with spoons halfway to their mouths. Caleb stood at the head of the table with one hand resting on the back of his chair, and Lily Whitaker sat in the small chair beside Rose as if she had been invited by someone braver than any person in the room. Rose did not look at Caleb for permission. She did not look at Harlan for judgment. She simply lifted the small plate she had kept warm near the stove and set it before the child. On it was a modest helping of stew, 2 soft pieces of potato, and 1 biscuit smaller than the rest, uneven on one side where the dough had folded in on itself. Lily stared at the biscuit first. Her small fingers rested against the edge of the table. Rose kept her voice low enough that it did not challenge the room. "That one tried its best," she said. "It came out a little crooked, but I figured that still counted for something." One of the younger ranch hands glanced down at his bowl. Another shifted in his chair. Harlan opened his mouth, but Caleb's eyes cut toward him, and whatever remark had been waiting there died before it reached the air. Lily touched the biscuit with the tip of one finger. She did not pick it up at first. She only turned it a little, studying the brown top, the broken edge, the steam that rose when Rose split it open and tucked a small pat of butter inside. The butter melted quick and golden. Rose pushed the plate no farther. "You do not have to eat it," she said softly. "It can just sit there and be warm." Lily looked up at her. Rose held still. She had learned that frightened creatures did not come closer when chased, and grieving children were no different. Across the table, Caleb's grip tightened on the chair back. His knuckles paled, but he said nothing. Lily lifted the biscuit with both hands. She brought it to her mouth and took a bite so small it barely changed the shape of it. The whole kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stared as if he had forgotten the world had walls. The child chewed slowly, swallowed, and looked down at the plate again. Rose turned back to the stove before anyone could make too much of it. She stirred the pot, though it did not need stirring. Behind her came the soft scrape of Lily's spoon against the plate. Once, then again. A ranch hand near the middle of the table lowered his hat into his lap. Someone breathed out like a man setting down a heavy feed sack. Caleb had not moved. Rose felt his attention on her, heavy and bewildered, but she kept working. She poured more coffee, set extra biscuits near the men, and pretended she did not notice when Lily ate half the stew and most of the biscuit. Then the child held up the last small piece. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than the stove settling, but it crossed the room clear as a church bell. Again. The word struck Caleb so hard he took one step back from the table. His chair legs dragged against the floor. No one spoke. No one dared. Lily looked startled by her own voice, as if it had opened a door she thought was locked forever. Rose slowly turned. She did not smile in triumph. She only reached for the pan, chose another small biscuit, broke it open, and placed it beside Lily's plate. "Of course," she whispered. Caleb turned away before his face could betray him, but Rose saw his hand shake once at his side. He walked out through the back door into the deepening evening, leaving it open behind him. Cold air slipped into the kitchen, but nobody complained. Outside, Caleb stopped at the porch rail and looked toward the dark pasture, his shoulders rigid beneath his worn work shirt. Inside, Lily took another bite. Harlan stared at the table. The men ate quietly. And Rose Callahan stood beside the stove with flour still on her skirt, understanding that one crooked biscuit had done what no command in that house had managed to do. It had made a silent child ask for more. By the time the last supper bowl had been washed and turned upside down beside the basin, the ranch house had settled into a different kind of quiet. It was not warm yet, not the way a house became warm after years of laughter and Sunday pies and little boots running down the hall, but the stove still held a steady glow, and Lily had carried her doll to the chair nearest the kitchen instead of vanishing upstairs. Rose worked with her sleeves rolled to the wrist, mending the torn flour sack with small careful stitches. She had saved what she could from the spill in the yard and folded the sack twice at the seam, because waste had always felt like an insult to hunger. Caleb came in through the back door without his hat. Evening had darkened his hair and put a tired look around his eyes. He paused when he saw Lily asleep in the chair, her cheek resting against the doll, one hand still curled as though holding half a biscuit. His face changed before he could stop it. Rose looked away, giving him the mercy of not being witnessed too closely. "She can stay there a minute," Caleb said, though no one had asked. "Yes, sir." Rose pulled the needle through the burlap. The thread snagged on a folded corner inside the sack. She reached in, expecting a lump of dried flour paste, and instead drew out a small piece of paper, creased many times and softened from being handled. The moment she saw it, her fingers closed around it. Too late. Caleb had already seen the change in her hands. "What is that?" "Nothing that belongs in your kitchen." She moved to tuck it into her apron pocket, but the paper slipped, opened, and fell face up on the table between them. Caleb did not touch it at first. His eyes lowered. The words were written in a narrow, neat hand, the kind of hand that had practiced being cruel without smudging the ink. "No decent man wants a fat cook. Keep to the kitchen where you belong." The stove popped softly. Rose reached for the note, but Caleb put 2 fingers on the edge of it, not taking it from her, only keeping it from disappearing. His voice was low. "Who wrote this?" Rose kept her chin steady. "Somebody who thought paper made them brave." "That does not answer me. It was old before I got here. Old hurt does not become harmless just because a person folds it small." That made her look at him. His face held no pity, and somehow that was harder to bear than pity would have been. Pity looked down. Caleb was looking straight at her. Rose drew the paper back and folded it once, then again. "I worked at the Pritchard boarding house kitchen in town. 6 months. I cooked breakfast for travelers, dinner for minors, pies for church socials, and soup for men who never said thank you because the bowl was already empty by the time they remembered manners. And then," she pressed the crease flat with her thumb, "and then a silver spoon went missing. Mrs. Pritchard said it was found near my trunk. I said I had not taken it. She said women like me always wanted something that was not theirs." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Did anyone believe you?" Rose gave him a small tired smile. "Mr. Whitaker, people usually believe the woman with the clean gloves before they believe the woman who scrubs the pots." Lily stirred in the chair, and both of them went still until the child settled again. Caleb looked toward the sleeping girl, then back at Rose. "Why keep the note?" Rose slipped it into her pocket. "Because some days I needed to remember what I was walking away from." Before Caleb could answer, a horse sounded in the yard, then another. Lantern light moved across the kitchen window. Voices carried from outside, one male, one female, clipped and confident. Rose knew the woman's voice before the knock ever came. Caleb stepped to the window and looked out. His hand rested on the frame. "Sheriff is here," he said. Rose wiped her hands slowly on her apron. He did not come alone. The knock struck the back door, sharp as a gavel. From the yard, Mrs. Agnes Pritchard called through the cold glass, "Mr. Whitaker, I believe you have taken in a woman who left town with property that was not hers." Caleb opened the back door before Mrs. Pritchard could knock again. Cold night air slipped around him, carrying the smell of horses, damp wool, and trouble that had dressed itself in Sunday manners. Sheriff Tom Avery stood on the step with his hat in both hands, looking more tired than official. Beside him, Mrs. Agnes Pritchard held her chin high beneath a black bonnet trimmed with stiff ribbon, her gloves clean enough to shame the whole kitchen. Her eyes passed over Rose, over the sleeping child, over the warm stove, and stopped on the flour dust still clinging to Rose's skirt. "There she is," Mrs. Pritchard said. "I warned town she would find another soft heart to fool." Caleb did not step aside. "This is my house. And stolen property is stolen property wherever it is carried." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, I am obliged to ask a few questions." Lily shifted in the chair and gave a small broken cough. Rose turned before anyone else did. The child's cheeks had gone bright with fever, and her lashes trembled against her skin. Rose crossed the kitchen quietly, laid the back of her fingers against Lily's forehead, and felt heat there that made her own breath catch. "She is burning up," Rose said. Caleb was beside them at once. "She was fine at supper." Fever comes like weather. It does not ask permission. Mrs. Pritchard made a sharp sound. Convenient. Caleb looked at her then, and the room seemed to lose several degrees. Not another word. The sheriff lowered his eyes. Rose lifted Lily carefully from the chair, and this time Caleb did not tell her to take her hands away. The child stirred, half awake, and turned her face into Rose's shoulder as if the apron and flour and kitchen smoke had already become something safe. Caleb saw it. Mrs. Pritchard saw it too, and her mouth pinched tight. I need water boiled, Rose said. Clean cloths. If there is willow bark, bring it. If not, peppermint or chamomile. And move that cot closer to the stove. No one moved for one breath. Then Caleb did. He carried the cot from the pantry himself and set it near the warmest corner. Sheriff Avery fetched water without being asked twice. Even Harlan, who had drifted in from the yard to watch the trouble, stood uncertain in the doorway until Caleb said, "Wood." Harlan vanished and returned with an armload of dry split logs. Rose did not thank any of them. She was too busy cooling Lily's face, spooning broth between the child's lips, and humming under her breath when Lily whimpered. It was not a pretty song. It was plain and low, the kind of kitchen song women used when the work was hard and the night was long. Caleb stood near the wall until midnight, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Every time Lily's breathing hitched, his hand closed around the back of a chair. Every time Rose leaned close and whispered, "Easy, sweetheart. I am right here," the child settled again. Mrs. Pritchard left before dawn, displeased and pale with frustration, promising she would return when the house was done pretending. The sheriff followed her, but not before tipping his hat to Rose. Morning came gray over the pasture. Lily finally slept with one hand wrapped around Rose's finger. Caleb placed a cup of coffee on the table beside Rose, careful not to wake the child. "You have been sitting on that floor for 6 hours, he said. Rose looked up, eyes tired but steady. "Your daughter needed someone low enough to hear her." He swallowed and glanced toward the narrow pantry cot. "You will not sleep by the pantry anymore. It is too cold." Rose said nothing. "There is a room off the kitchen," he continued. "Small, but it has a window and a decent quilt. You can use it. Until you find another cook?" Caleb looked at Lily's hand holding Rose's finger. "Until I say otherwise." The words hung there, quieter than thanks and heavier than kindness. Outside, hoofs sounded again in the yard, and Mrs. Pritchard's voice cut through the morning like a blade wrapped in lace. "Sheriff, search her things before she hides them better." Rose closed her eyes once, then opened them. Caleb turned toward the door, and this time he did not look like a lonely man guarding an empty house. He looked like a man beginning to understand what had come alive inside it. By full morning, the yard outside Whitaker Ranch had filled with witnesses who pretended they had come on business. 2 ranch hands stood near the pump with empty buckets. Harlan lingered by the tack room, arms crossed, wearing the pleased look of a man who expected another person's shame to feed him better than breakfast. Sheriff Avery waited beside the kitchen table, hat in hand again, his eyes moving from Caleb to Rose and back, as if he wished the law had chosen a different doorstep. Mrs. Pritchard stood in the center of the room like she owned the floorboards, her black skirt spotless, her gloved hands folded over the silver clasp of her handbag. Rose had washed her face, changed into a clean apron, and braided her hair tight, but her eyes still carried the long night she had spent beside Lily. The child sat wrapped in a quilt near the stove, pale but awake, watching everything with a stillness that made Caleb's mouth go hard. "This will not take long," Mrs. Pritchard said. "It never does when guilt is simple." Rose said nothing. She placed her valise on the table herself. That made Harlan shift in the doorway. Perhaps he had hoped to see her refuse. Perhaps he had hoped to see Caleb force her. She gave neither of them that pleasure. "Sheriff," she said, "you may look." Avery opened the valise carefully as though ashamed of his own fingers. Inside lay one spare dress, 2 folded aprons, a hairbrush with a cracked handle, a small Bible, 3 recipes tied with string, and a cloth bundle of coins so few they barely made a sound. Mrs. Pritchard's lips thinned. "Check beneath the lining." Caleb stood by the back door with his arms at his sides. He had not spoken since they entered. That silence held the room tighter than shouting would have. Sheriff Avery lifted the lining. For a moment, there was nothing. Then something bright slid from the corner seam and tapped against the wood. A silver spoon. The kitchen went still. Mrs. Pritchard inhaled through her nose, soft and satisfied. There, she said. The Lord does have a way of bringing hidden things into the light. Rose looked at the spoon as if it had arrived from a bad dream. Her face lost color, but she did not step back. That was not in my valise. Harlan gave a low laugh from the doorway. Course it was not. Caleb's eyes moved to him. Harlan looked away, but too late. Lily pushed the quilt off her lap. Rose turned at once. Stay warm, sweetheart. The child did not listen. She climbed down from the chair, weak but determined, and walked to the table. No one moved to stop her. She stood beside Rose and looked at the spoon, then at Mrs. Pritchard. The older woman's smile sharpened. Poor child. You see now what kind of woman your father brought into your kitchen. Lily's fingers found the side of Rose's apron. Rose's hand hovered near the child's shoulder, but did not touch until Lily leaned closer. No, Lily said. It was small, but every person heard it. Mrs. Pritchard blinked. What was that? Lily's voice shook, then rose. No, Caleb took one step forward. The sheriff stared at the child as if the stove itself had spoken. Harlan stopped smiling. Lily pointed at the spoon with one trembling finger. She did not hide it. Mrs. Pritchard's cheeks flushed. You are feverish, dear. You do not know what you are saying. Lily turned toward Caleb, and for the first time since her mother's death, she spoke with tears in her voice and fire behind the tears. Papa, she was with me. All night. She never left. The words landed harder than any accusation. Rose closed her eyes, not in defeat, but because the child had spent her strength defending her. Mrs. Pritchard recovered quickly. Sentiment is not evidence. Caleb moved to the table at last. He picked up the silver spoon, turning it slowly between his fingers. The handle carried the stamped letter P, polished bright from use. Then his thumb paused near the underside, where a smaller mark had been scratched into the metal. His eyes narrowed. Sheriff Avery leaned closer. What is it? Caleb did not answer right away. He looked first at Rose, then at Lily, then at Harlan, who had gone very still by the door. Outside, the men in the yard had stopped pretending not to listen. Caleb held the spoon up into the morning light, and whatever he saw there changed the whole room before he said a word. Caleb held the spoon where the morning light could find the mark beneath the handle. It was not the polished P that Mrs. Pritchard wanted everyone to see. It was the smaller scratch near the bowl, a date cut into the silver with a jeweler's point, neat enough to be official and careless enough to be overlooked. Sheriff Avery leaned in, his brow furrowing. April 12th, he read. Rose looked up slowly. Caleb's voice stayed quiet, but every person in the kitchen seemed to step closer to hear it. Mrs. Callahan left your boarding house in March. The room did not breathe. Mrs. Pritchard's gloved fingers tightened around her handbag clasp. That proves nothing. The date could mean anything. Caleb turned the spoon in his hand. It means the spoon was marked after she was gone. Sheriff Avery took it from him and studied the scratch. His tired face grew older by several years. Mrs. Pritchard? I will not be questioned like a criminal in a ranch kitchen. No one called you one, Caleb said. Yet? Harlan shifted near the door, and the floorboard under his boot creaked. Caleb's eyes moved to him. You have been quiet, Briggs. Ain't my spoon. It was in her valise. So somebody put it there. Harlan looked toward Mrs. Pritchard too fast. That glance did what Lily's plea and Rose's silence had not done. It tied the room together. Sheriff Avery saw it. Caleb saw it. Even the men outside saw enough through the open door to stop pretending they had come for water. Mrs. Pritchard lifted her chin. This is shameful. You would take the word of a hired kitchen woman over mine. Caleb stepped between Rose and the table, not touching her, not crowding her, simply placing his body where every accusation would have to pass him first. I am not taking her word over yours, he said. I am taking the truth over a lie. Mrs. Pritchard's face hardened. You always were a lonely man, Caleb Whitaker. Lonely men are easily fooled by warm bread and soft voices. Caleb did not flinch. Maybe. But I know what a thief looks like when something decent walks into a room. The sheriff cleared his throat, but he did not stop him. Caleb set the spoon down on the table with a small, clean sound. She did not steal from you. You stole her name. You let a whole town look at her like she was less than honest, because it was easier than admitting you were cruel. Mrs. Pritchard's mouth opened, but no words came. Harlan gave a weak laugh, trying to drag the world back to where it had been that morning. Boss, it is 1 spoon and 1 cook. We got fence line to mend. Caleb turned to him. Pack your bedroll. Harlan blinked. What? You heard me. You are throwing me off over her? Caleb took 1 slow step toward the doorway. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I am throwing you off because you watched a lie get planted under my roof, and you smiled like it was supper. Harlan looked around for support. The ranch hands outside found sudden interest in their boots, their buckets, the sky, anything but him. His face went dull with understanding. He stepped back from the door. Caleb turned toward the sheriff. Take that spoon where it belongs. If there is a charge to be written, write it on the person who carried it here. Sheriff Avery nodded once, solemn and ashamed. Mrs. Pritchard pulled her gloves tighter, but her hands shook as she reached for the table. Caleb moved the spoon out of her reach and handed it to the sheriff instead. Then he faced the kitchen, the yard, the listening men, the child wrapped in a quilt, and the woman who had stood through all of it without begging to be believed. Rose Callahan stays, he said. The words settled over the floorboards like a nail driven true. She eats at my table. She works in my kitchen because she chooses to, not because any person here owns her place. She is under my roof, and any man who laughs at her answers to me. No one spoke. The silence was not empty this time. It was full of men remembering their laughter and finding it smaller than they liked. Lily slipped from her chair and crossed the room on unsteady feet. Rose bent at once, but Lily reached her first, wrapping both arms around her waist. Her voice came muffled against Rose's apron, small and certain. Mama Rose. Rose went still. Caleb's eyes closed for half a second, as if those 2 words had reached a place in him no one had touched in years. Mrs. Pritchard turned away first. Harlan followed without a word. The sheriff carried the spoon into the morning. And in the kitchen that had once forgotten fire, every person left standing understood that Rose Callahan had not been rescued from shame. She had outlasted it, and Caleb Whitaker had finally chosen to stand where the whole ranch could see him. 1 year later, Whitaker Ranch woke before sunrise to the smell of bread. It came through the house first, slipping under doors, warming the hall, touching the blue shawl that no longer hung like a ghost on the peg because Rose had folded it gently into a cedar chest with Caleb beside her. The kitchen fire burned steady. Coffee darkened in the pot. Biscuits rose golden in the oven. Outside, horses stamped in the cold morning dirt while men crossed the yard with washed faces and quieter voices than they had brought to that same house a year before. No one entered Rose's kitchen wearing a hat anymore. Not because she demanded it, but because one morning old Mr. Dunleavy had taken his off before sitting down, and every man after him decided respect was easier than shame. Lily sat at the work table in her nightdress and wool socks, drawing crooked flowers on a scrap of brown paper while Rose rolled dough. She was still small, still solemn sometimes, but her silence no longer ruled the room. It came and went like clouds. Some mornings she sang to her doll. Some evenings she read aloud beside the stove. And whenever strangers came through the ranch and asked who ran the kitchen, Lily lifted her chin and said, "Mama Rose does." The first time she said it. In front of Caleb, Rose had nearly dropped a pie. Caleb had only looked down at his coffee, but his ears had gone red, and Lily had smiled as if she had known exactly what she had done. That morning, Caleb came in carrying an armload of split wood, his sleeves rolled to the forearms, frost silvering the shoulders of his coat. He set the wood beside the stove and did not leave. Rose noticed. He had grown better at staying. A year ago, he had hovered at doorways like a man afraid warmth might ask something of him. Now he stood close enough to hand her the flour without being told. "Town wagon passed the south road," he said. Sheriff Avery brought news. Rose kept cutting biscuits. Good news, or the kind that spoils coffee? Mrs. Pritchard sold the boarding house. Rose's hands paused only a second. Did she? Moved east, they say. Then I hope she finds a kitchen that teaches her mercy. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You still say things like that? Like what? Kind things about people who gave you none. Rose placed another biscuit on the pan. I do not say them for her. He understood. He always did now, though he still used fewer words than most men used to ask for salt. The ranch hands came in soon after, boots thudding, voices low with morning hunger. They thanked Rose by name. They thanked Lily when she passed the butter. At the far end of the table, the chair that had once stayed empty now held a cushion Lily had stitched herself, uneven but bright. Caleb sat at the head of the table, but he no longer looked like a man eating alone among hired hands. He looked across plates, bread, coffee, and lamplight, and his eyes found Rose every time. After breakfast, when the men had gone and Lily had run outside to show Mr. Dunlevy the first green shoot near the pump, Caleb placed something on the table. It was the silver spoon. The same one that had once carried a lie into his house. Now it had been polished clean, the false accusation worn down to nothing but memory. Beside it lay a plain gold ring. Rose stared at both, her hand still resting on the back of a chair. Caleb took off his hat, though they were indoors, and he was nervous enough to forget his own rules. I am not a man who says things pretty, he began. Rose's throat tightened. I know. But I know what happened to this ranch after you walked through that door. Lily laughed again. The men remembered how to bow their heads. I remembered how to come inside before dark. He pushed the ring a little closer. They laughed when you came here. Rose looked toward the stove, toward the table, toward the window where Lily's laughter floated in from the yard. And you? Caleb's voice lowered. I saw home before I knew what I was looking at. Rose covered the ring with her hand, and Caleb covered her hand with his. No grand speech followed. No crowd gathered. The bread cooled on the table, the coffee steamed between them, and outside, Lily called for them both to come see the green thing growing by the pump. Rose laughed then, soft and full, and Caleb smiled like a man finally forgiven by his own house. By supper, the whole ranch smelled of stew and fresh bread again, and when Lily ran in calling, Mama Rose, Papa, it is time, no one corrected her. The lonely house had become a home, not all at once, not by magic, but by fire kept burning,